Good morning, viewers. We're just at about 7:13 a.m. and welcome back to the Tobago Updates morning show, coming to you here live from the Port Mall in Scarborough, Tobago. As we continue the conversation this morning, we get started with Michael Anisette, and he's the General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center, NATUC, joining us online. Good morning to you, Michael Anisette.
Pleasant morning to you. Are you hearing me?
Good morning.
Hello? Morning, morning.
Excellent. Hearing you loud and clear. As we get the conversation
Okay.
started this morning, we're in January of 2024, and we are speaking NATUC's perspective on the minimum wage that has taken effect from January 1st, 2024. So let's start there for NATUC. When you heard the announcement made with the increase in minimum wage and seeing it begin to take effect in this month, your initial reactions?
Well, pleasant morning to Tobago and blessings to Tobago. All right, and as I always say, may the Most High and our ancestor guide us and protect us during these troubled times that we are experiencing. Having said that, we in the National Trade Union Center and the labor movement do not want the conversation to vie around the question of a minimum wage, because minimum wage is what it means, just a minimum wage that is legislated by the government. We prefer to discuss the question of living wages, one, and the question of the growing inequality as it relates to income and wealth in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, the question of minimum wage doesn't jive in our narrative and in the context of how we view an economy whereby you speak to sustainable jobs and sustainable wages to allow workers to evolve into a better state.
All right, you're talking about living wage, right? And when you talk about living wage, just break it down a little bit for us because the conversation is minimum wage, but you prefer to align it to a living wage, which of course relates to sustainable living, sustainable employment, and the ability to live in a way that is of a certain standard of living. Is this what you're referring to?
Yes, this is what I am referring to, and if I may coin a phrase from the ILO, International Labour Organization, who preaches decent wages for workers.
All right. So bearing that in mind, what's your perspective at this point in terms of the ability? How do you view the current minimum wage here in Trinidad and Tobago based on the last increase? Do you believe it is getting us to that point? It is still well below the average. What's your perspective as Natu? And I see you smile for this one.
Yes, yeah, I have to smile because if one looks at the minimum wage, which is 20.50 an hour, and if you do a multi-calculation, that means that a minimum wage worker in Tobago, and one must remember that the cost of living in Tobago is much higher than in Trinidad and Tobago. That is an economic reality that we do not pay attention to. And therefore, that will convert into $3,552.65. If you are a single parent with two children or three children, you have to pay a rent. You don't own a property and or a house, or you have to pay mortgage. You're looking at a minimum of $2,000 a month for rent. Mortgage will be much higher. So you are left with $1,552.65 for the month to ensure that you get your children's school book, that you buy proper food, that you pay transportation and all the other basic amenities that is required to keep a household flowing and your children going. And I talk to the children because one must recognize that if you do not have children who are fed properly with the nutrition that is necessary for their minds to grow, you're going to have problems in terms of the cognitive skills and the ability to absorb and to take in work. So then wages speaks to that also. And the question that we must ask ourselves, and I think this is the conversation that NATUC wants, that is that fair? Is that fair to Trinidad and Tobago, given the growing inequalities as it relates to income and wealth in Trinidad and Tobago? And we do not buy the conversation that, hey, we don't have the money to pay. We believe is that this government in particularly pays attention to downgrading wages, because this government have been in office for extended period of time, and we are still in a position of negotiating wages for workers going back to 2012. And the question of time value of money as an economic philosophy comes into being. And how do you as a government, and I want Tobago and Trinidad to understand, break the law in that the Industrial Relations Act speaks to the question of having negotiations every 3 years. And this government, they would have failed to so do. But more importantly, the government would have sat down and determined on their own no kind of negotiations. It is a fundamental breach of the ILO principle governing collective bargaining. And I tell Trinidad and Tobago, we would have reported the government to the ILO body, where the government prime minister makes a statement, or the minister of finance in a political forum, to say, well, we could only pay 2% or 4% over a 6-year. That is not collective bargaining. That is dictatorial construct which has no place in a modern democratic society.
Do you have the statistics that I speak to you're saying quite clearly you don't buy the argument of that they don't have. Does NATUC have the statistic that speaks to what can be the payment of a better minimum wage, a better living wage in Trinidad and Tobago? And if so, on estimate, what is an acceptable figure for NATUC?
All right, let me just give 2 examples. Are you aware that the minimum wage board, where they have union representative, private sector, academia, and all the other persons who construct that or who is part of that board, would have made a recommendation of $29, but then they agreed to $24.50. Okay, that is the minimum wage board who has all the expertise. Are you aware is that the private sector would have pushed the government into agreeing to 2050 because the government wanted to give less than 2050. No, you wouldn't hear those kinds of conversation. So the point that I am making, and I will continue to make, if you want to build a society with all the creativity and the innovativeness and the ability that we have as a country, and you want to build a society on minimum wages, you want to build a society where selling food in Answer Group or KFC or Royal Castle ritual is the manner in which you employ people. And somebody will tell me they just do that in the United States. But if you look at the United States, which we have done the research, it is done in respect to children who are going to school and who need supplemental income, but not grown-up people to mind their families. And you see, if we don't look at that, what are we doing to our children? What are we telling our children? That going to school to get 4 and 5 passes means I'm going to sell chicken and chips? You are downgrading the minds of the children. And therefore, the question of the minimum wage is a form of willful social control. That is how we see it in NATUC. There's no basis. And I want to go over to Tobago. Tobago cost of living is much is much higher. If you do the research, how do you justify if the cost of living in Tobago is astronomically higher than in Tobago? How do you give a minimum wage across the board that doesn't address the real economic realities that is being faced by Trinidad and Tobago? And then that is why we are saying that the concept of a minimum wage is flawed, and it does nothing to uplift our society in a level that we hope that it should go to.
Going to lead to that question as well, because as you did mention that the cost of living in Tobago is significantly higher, in fact, not just higher, significantly higher than it is in Trinidad. And so now we have a minimum wage that is across the board, which means that we both islands get the same minimum wage, but Tobago having to pay more for goods and services, which of course does not lend to equality. Another thing that you touched on that I thought to ask about is, has any comparison been made with any other of the islands? And you mentioned the United States, where you talk about people working in these franchise chain restaurants and stuff like that. Has any comparison been made even across the region in terms of how do they come to a minimum wage? What are the statistics? What are the contributing factors to determining a minimum wage? And what is the ratio and the difference between our minimum wage here in Trinidad and Tobago as it relates to across the islands? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I could speak to that, but the first thing that I want you to understand, all right, and you are making the point that we are making in the National Trade Union Center and the labor movement, that when you talk about wages, wages has to reflect the cost of living that faces you in reality. And therefore, we are saying when you talk about minimum wage, it doesn't apply in our particular situation. You must talk about decent and living wages. And if we were talking about decent and living wages, the analysis that you are talking about in respect to Tobago would have been part of the equation, and therefore the question of how do you share the pie in terms of Tobago given their cost of living and Trinidad. Is it fair, economic and financially and humanly fair, to give them the same amount of money where I will have to pay in some instances as much as 10 to 20% more in terms of goods and services with the little research that we would have done, and in some instances as much as 30 percentage points more? And therefore the inequality continues within the construct of having the conversation of minimum wage. And as I am saying, that this is a political plan to downgrade wages. We used to say it in the old, which we call slavery wages, where you just have to work and live from salary to salary, the ability to save and reinvest for the future. All right, the ability to have real income does not rise. And I am saying, right, that given where we are in Trinidad and Tobago, given where other CEOs in other industries are in terms of terms and conditions, one, and then given the fact that the private sector in Trinidad and Tobago would have registered agreements in the industrial court for the said 6-year periods, and the minimum wage increase that was given, when you do an aggregate, it is 9 percentage points for a 3-year period. So how does the government come and tell a public servant that you don't get, you're getting 0-0? You know what 0-0 means? That there is no increase in your pension benefits as a consequence because there is no increase in your salaries. Is that what we want for Trinidad and Tobago? Is that fair to the workers who would have worked, all right, for the government over an extended period of time and would have reached their retirement age, would have been expecting increase in pensions, and the government, without any regard whatsoever for those groups of workers, say, I am giving you 0-0. That is the issue. And then let me deal with what is happening in other countries. You see, other countries do not have to wait within the Caribbean region for 10 years to get wage increase, for 12 years to get wage increase. And in some, and in an institution, the last increase they got was in 2007, and they only got an increase last year. Right? So then you are not comparing apples with apples. And all we are saying that the government as an employer has a responsibility to ensure that the law is honored, just like how the private sector can honor the law. And if the private sector can find the finances to pay an average of 9% over a 3-year period, how do you justify that you paying 2% over the said period within the same economy and within the same issues that the private sector will have to face as an employer, like the government as an employer? And we have to make the distinction, brothers and sisters, and the listening public, the distinction between the government as an employer who has a legal and moral responsibility to ensure that those who they employ are properly paid based on their skills, based on their education, and based on all the other things, but more importantly, based on what is the true cost of living in the country and in the various entities.
Very much there, Michael Anisette, really giving us that overall perspective on the part of NATUC. Thank you so much for joining us on set this morning to bring us that information. General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center, Michael Anisette. All right, viewers, at this point we prepare to head on over to our next interview. Who do we have coming up next? It is Inspector Alicia Piggott of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. So we'll have coming up in the next discussion. Inspector Alicia Piggott of the TTPS. And certainly, as I say, anytime that we have TTPS on, they come and certainly is to treat with some very pertinent and serious issues in the happenings here in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course more specifically Tobago. So we have coming up next Inspector Alicia Piggott. All right, viewers, we want to thank you so much for your continued love and support and for continuing to choose the Tobago Updates morning show. And we want to remind you that this is your opportunity to share the life, share the life, share the life.